So when Deborah asked me to talk this Sunday about critical race theory, I was wondering, like, what would I, as a white man living here in Omaha, Nebraska, have to say about critical race theory? And I've been fortunate over the years in my life to take part in several conferences on diversity, equity, and inclusion, training, kind of racial equity, kind of anti-bias work. And so I thought I would maybe consult those the wisdom of those others that I've been fortunate to learn from, and try to share what they have had to say, because they have a lot of wisdom from not only work and understanding how these systems are, but and kind of teaching about race, but also have to live in these systems that oppress them every day. And we think about race, like transportation systems are about race, education is about race, prisons are about race, the environment is about race, housing is about race. My role as an urban planner is about race. We at Urban Abbey think about this. We did this book study a couple years ago, The Color of Law, about race. And this little tagline here, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And, heard the question asked before, well, forgotten by who? It's forgotten by maybe us as white people, but we need to reflect on, why didn't we notice that before? So if these systems are about race, then we would be wise to be critical about those. These systems are not broken. They're designed to do exactly what they're doing, to oppress others. If you're like me, when I was growing up, basically this is what I learned about race in the United States. There was slavery. Some of the masters were nice and had great relationships with their slaves. Abraham Lincoln came around, and everything was pretty much better after the Civil War. But there were still some bad people in the South, and they were part of the KKK. But Martin Luther King had a dream, and then everything's been awesome since then. Like, that's kind of what I learned. No mention of treating of indigenous people, lynchings, redlining, Jim Crow, kind of mass incarceration, and on and on. No mention of 1619, or how in 1667 sort of changed this rule that conversion to Christianity was no longer a way to change the status of slavery. It was always about power. It was about keeping the poor in their place, and the advantage and power has always been the goal, and oppression has been the tool to do that. So we think about power and who has power and who doesn't. These people in our communities are not poor because we lack programs or sometimes access to goods and resources. We have poor in our community because they lack power. And that power is extracted from people and given to institutions and systems to keep people oppressed. And we can abuse that power when we don't consider the power that we have, and examine the ways that we can take part in liberating these systems. And these systems have kept people enslaved and segregated and incarcerated and terrorized. So what are we doing to kind of change that for the future? If this on the 4th of July weekend, we understand that our ancestors were colonizers, and we should ask, well, what kind of ancestor do we want to be in the future? How are we kind of working to redistribute the power that we have, and learn from those that have power already in their communities, so that their children will grow up assuming power? Audre Lorde, I've heard this quote many times, like, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So when we see these systems that are creating these disparities as they're intended to, when these things pop up, race is always the issue. thinking about this, and Thomas Jefferson, there's a quote I've heard from him that said, "If there's a just God, we are going to pay for this." So we should think about this like individual and systems change and reflect on what we can do. I use Facebook for a lot of reasons, but one reason is the Facebook memories part. You can see this, and you can see what you posted, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and I think a lot of it's very cringy. The things like why would I, what was I thinking? There's like this criticism of social media that we try to curate this like perfect image, and if I look at my Facebook memories, I do not know what sort of image I was trying to curate, because I was kind of an idiot a lot of times, I think. But it reminds me of the evolution and the ways that maybe I'm changing, and if I can change, others in our communities can, and we should have grace for others on this journey. And wise people have talked about in this issue, like this kind of work, you should calling people in instead of calling them out, and helping them kind of process through this journey. So in thinking about these institutions and systems, we can understand our role in this, and how that power plays out in our neighborhoods, in our social circles, and we can analyze and challenge our privilege and approach it with curiosity. We'll be less likely to be defensive when we are curious about things. And so in these racist kind of systems, I've heard this too, that the shark isn't really the problem, it's the water that's the issue, this environment. And as white people, we don't know that we're wet. And I think that's really interesting. Like, we are products of this society, and so it will take all of us to fix this. And a few years ago, I took part in a training through the Racial Equity Institute. And the last thing in this week-long training, we were asked by the facilitator to write down everything that we liked about our race. And there was people from several race and ethnicities and backgrounds in this group. And so I'm thinking, what is it that I like about being white? And I was like, well, I didn't have anything to say. And the facilitator said, this is true of everywhere I do this training, that people that are white have really nothing to say here. Others that are from maybe like African American or Latino or Arabic or wherever, they will talk about traditions and customs and clothing and food and this. And the facilitator said, this is what we have as white people. We traded all of this kind of history for privilege. That's what we have in the United States, the privilege. So, what does all this have to do with Christianity? Has a lot to do with this, right? The governor of Mississippi in the 1850s, William McWillie, said, as Christian people, it's the duty of the South to keep slaves in their place. Sort of contrasting that, around the same time, poet Phyllis Wheatley said, in every human breast, God has implanted a principle. We call it love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. I will assert that that same principle lives in us. God grants us deliverance in his own way and time. So Phyllis Wheatley was 20 when she published, it was the first African-American poet to be published in the United States in 1773. So she's asking us and inviting us to be very kind of proximate to these problems, to change the narrative, to be willing to be uncomfortable, because the enemy of justice is hopelessness, and we can commit and engage to working on this. But we have this lie, and this lie that is that this kind of Christian nationalism, that this idea of manifest destiny, that God has chosen this country somehow to be the best, and that is an organized lie, and it's very powerful. It's more powerful than a sort of a disorganized truth. John 8, Jesus says, if you keep my teachings, you are my followers. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This last week, I was curious, what are other churches saying about critical race theory? So that was my Google search. And I found an opinion columnist in the Tennessean just this last week named Don Beeler. And Don Beeler says this, Jesus taught his followers to forgive as he forgives. But with critical race theory, there's no forgiveness or redemption. Rather, there's endless condemnation and shame. The theory also ignores decades of progress in racial relations and the many achievements by people of color. Martin Luther King dreamt of the day when his children would not be judged by the color of their skin. While many well-meaning Christians and churches have embraced CRT, they miss the deceptiveness of the teaching. This is what Don says. The Bible moves us towards systemic unity, reconciliation, and healing, which I would agree with, to this guy, Don, that, the Bible does move us towards that. But we, typically, the church has been known for, in this issue of not reconciling communities and not bringing unity to communities. He goes on to say that CRT is built on the framework of atheistic Marxism and seeks to normalize disunity and turmoil and pain. To that I say, Don, you're wrong. When we examine race critically, we see that this normalizing of systemic disunity, that was actually done mostly by the work of white supremacy, not atheistic Marxists. Don finishes by saying, Jesus told his disciples that they would recognize false teachings by their fruit. And critical race theory's fruit has been division, destruction, and unforgiveness. I will say that Don is right, that Jesus says that you'll recognize false teachers by their fruit. But we should ask ourselves, how do we know that good fruit grows? Where does it grow? We can bear good fruit by remaining in close proximity and examining the example of Jesus and that truth. The sooner we do this, the sooner we can learn about the truth of these inequities and how race has upheld these disparities, these systems. And we're all implicated when we allow others to be mistreated. Jesus' act of liberation was announced in his first public sermon. It said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I've come to proclaim good news to the poor, proclaim freedom to the prisoner, and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. So how will we measure and evaluate our character? Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Institute says, we will know our character by how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, disfavored, accused, and condemned. I hope that we have the courage and bravery to proclaim that same good news to others. Amen.